Before we begin, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping items. This event is unclassified, open to the public, and it is being recorded, so please keep that in mind. If you have any problems with Zoom, please see the troubleshooting tips in your confirmation for your registration. Also, if you have questions for the panels, please send those to me as soon as possible, and I will try to get them to the moderators. Okay, so today we have an impressive group of speakers covering an interesting set of topics. Our first panel is on technology competition in the Pacific, moderated by Dr. Kori Schake. For our second session, we'll be hearing remarks from Vice Admiral John Hill of the Missile Defense Agency on competing in the Pacific from a missile defense perspective. Admiral Hill was unfortunately unable to attend today, but he recorded comments that we will be playing later on. And those comments will be a nice segue to our second panel on competing in the Pacific in an era of evolving missile threats, moderated by Aaron Mehta of Breaking Defense. And last, Dr. Kerry Buckley of MITRE will offer some conclusionary remarks. With that, I will hand it over to the moderator for the first panel. It's a huge honor for me to introduce Dr. Kori Schake. Kori is someone who's had an incredibly impressive career, both in and out of government. She is a prolific writer on defense and foreign affairs issues, and I think, most remarkably and most singularly, Kori is someone who, in this field, everyone seems to revere, and that is really unusual when you're thinking about foreign affairs and defense policy experts. And I would just hope that in addition to steering the conversation today, that Kori offers some of her own perspectives, because I know that I and our listeners, our viewers, will find those of high interest. Okay, with that, I am going to turn it to Kori.
Thank you, my friends. That was very generous and kind of you. I have the fun this morning of moderating a panel of people who are actual experts on the technology challenges in the Indo-Pacific. And I want to say, starting out, we are missing at this moment retired Brigadier General Steve Butow, the DIU Director of Space. And I feel like that's a fabulous place to start our conversation, which is the guy whose job is innovation is late to the party. And it feels like a metaphor for where we are in technology and turning our attention to the Indo-Pacific. We have with us two terrific panelists this morning, Dr. Keoki Jackson, the Senior Vice President and General Manager of MITRE. He holds a PhD from MIT, as you can see. Hold up your right hand, my friends. The beaver insignia on his ring, and was also a NASA fellow at MIT. And Thomas Shugart, a Navy veteran who has been the operational end of this challenge. He is currently a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security, where he runs undersea and maritime programs. He comes out of the Office of Net Assessment in the Pentagon. And as I mentioned, late to the innovation party, retired Brigadier General Steve Butow, the Director of Space Policy at the Defense Innovation Unit. And he has built the teams in California, in Texas, Thomas Shugart's alma mater. He studied mechanical engineering at the University of Texas. Steve built the team for DIU in Austin and also in Boston. And I have just finished reading a really fun book, Elliot Ackerman and Jim Stavridis' 2034. And it's a book about the consequences of our political moment in the United States, but also of falling behind in the technology competition with China. So the first question I want to run down the panel is, do you think the United States has maintained its technological edge over China? Starting with you, Keoki.
Make sure I've got the audio edge going here. Look, there's no doubt that there has been substantial erosion in the technological edge. And I mean, I'd characterize it as there are clear areas where the United States is ahead and a clear world later, but that gap has shrunk very rapidly. And frankly, there are areas where I'd say the Chinese and potentially the Russians are ahead. And so, you know, as you look at this landscape, I mean, I would just start with a very clear Chinese strategy that's been articulated years ago now to drive technological advantage in areas that are clearly, you know, geared towards military capabilities, but by and large have dramatic economic considerations as well. So the intent to dominate, you know, in this 2030 timeframe in areas like microelectronics, artificial intelligence, quantum information sciences, you can kind of go down that list, you know, biological sciences, and it's pretty clear that this is a long thought out and very, very well resourced strategy to surpass the United States. And I would argue that they are making great progress on that plan.
Tom, what do you think?
I certainly agree with the overall assessment there. And, you know, when you look at areas where they're ahead, in particular, I look at, and certainly in terms of scale, when I look at the PLA rocket forces, missile forces, for example, you know, we're just now working on intermediate range, conventional, precise ballistic missiles. You know, the Army, we have a joint program with the Army's working with the Navy, but it's still early days with that, as opposed to the latest China military power report, 200 plus launchers and 300 missiles in service that are, you know, precise, conventional, swappable warhead, intermediate range ballistic missiles. You know, obviously there are areas where we hold significant advantage. You know, I'm best familiar with the undersea. It's no secret that China's submarines, for example, are still noisy. Their nuclear ones, at least, are still noisy. But I worry that gap could close too in the future, particularly when I think about collaboration with the Russians, you know, who do have some very quiet submarines. So they clearly recognize those areas where they're far behind, and the ones that matter, they're clearly working to close.
Steve?
I'm glad you mentioned the 2034 book. Actually, it's on my nightstand, so I'm getting ready.
I read it recently too.
Yeah, I'm getting ready to read it. I would agree. I think we probably have some regret about shifting a lot of our manufacturing offshore, the industrial base, and really the underlayer of our industrial capacity is not in a healthy state today, and that underpins many things, whether it's aerospace, maritime, you know, our ability to rare earth metals, you know, and minerals. These are all things that are critical to preserving U.S. leadership, and not to mention talent, right? So we have our homework to do, but you know, we have there's some glimmers of hope. You know, China priced less profusely whenever they see what's going on down at Boca Chica with Elon Musk and SpaceX, and there's other things like that. But this is going to be a whole nation issue. It's not just the Department of Defense or Department of Education. It's going to be a whole nation solution to really address what we need to do so that the United States preserves its leadership through the 21st century.
That's such an interesting point. So I always despair when people in the defense ecosystem talk about the need for whole of nation strategy, because the last time I can think of that any Americans had a whole of nation strategy, it was the Shawnee Confederacy in 1805. And so if your strategy requires whole of nation effort, it seems to me you have a failing strategy. And that's part of the challenge we have in the contest with China, because authoritarian governments can direct activity, and as Keoki has said, have directed activity in productive ways in the technology space. But I want to ask, how much do you think, so our mythology, the story we tell ourselves as Americans, is that there is a trade-off in innovation between directed activity and creative activity, right? And you use the Elon Musk example.
That's right.
But the flip side of that coin, it seems to me, is that if you look at the success of the Asian tigers, the economies of Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, they actually did have successful investment strategies to create industrial strategies effectively. We're not going to have that. Is that an unrecoverable failure on our part, or can the big sloppy innovation ecosystem of the United States somehow compensate?
Well, it's an interesting question. First of all, my conviction is that in the long term, the ingenuity and the rewards that come with a more of a bottoms-up and capitalist-driven approach that favors, I'd say, individual results over state-directed approaches has been very successful for the United States and, frankly, for the West for a long, long time. Now, of course, you have to survive the short term to get to the long term, and I think that's, the short term could be years or decades, right? And so that's the challenge that we face here. I think, a little bit of it depends on what you define as industrial policy, and where's the line between picking winners and losers in particular sectors versus doing the kinds of things that raise all boats. And I do think there are some glimmers of hope, although I will tell you it's built on, I'd say, a lot of years of despair. You just look at the infrastructure for innovation in this nation, the things that were the crown jewels that drove a lot of the advances that became our, the core of our economy today and our military, our national laboratories, places like NIST, our service laboratories, our test infrastructure at places like NASA and the military services, in massive disrepair, underinvested over decades, billions and billions of dollars of deferred maintenance, not to mention lack of investment in new capabilities. So these are the places where, short of I'd say a specific industrial strategy, investments there can really make a difference for the nation. And we are starting to see some, in some of the latest spending plans, some significant pluses.
Excellent. Steve, I in particular want to hear from you on this.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what your comment about lack of strategy or failed strategy, I think I want to go back to that first, because I think it's we have no strategy. And when I say no strategy, I mean grand strategy. China is methodically executing a grand strategy to displace the U.S. as a world leader by their 100th anniversary of communism in 2049, and they're just chugging along doing that. I think what's important for us is just recognize, okay, well, that's their pursuit, but we need to have a long-term strategy. And as the United States, that grand strategy could be simple things that everybody agrees to, like the preservation of the international liberal order, or freedom, or the idea that we have free trade, with international partners. These are things that need to be part of the discussion today. Now, going back to the industrial base, boy, I tell you, so I was just at a meeting yesterday, and we're lamenting about, there's 150,000 less machinists today than there was 20 years ago, right? And so a lot of skills, a lot of things that we used to rely on just aren't there anymore. But another interesting factoid is that
is that a function of automation?
Well, I think it's a function of evolution, right? Because we've also gone to more computer-based, CNC type of machining and things of this nature, use of robotics. But I also think that if you look, the United States today controls about 12% of the semiconductor market, which, I grew up in Silicon Valley, which is that's pretty staggering, and it's probably shrinking too. But you know what? What that means is that it's an ideal time for disruption. So I'll remind everybody we're in aerospace today, and so these folks are the experts on it. But the United States probably controlled about an equal percentage of commercial launch a decade ago. And then what we did is we disrupted the market, and we have reusable spacecraft, launch vehicles, and things of this. And now the U.S. is in a large, is probably the lion's share of the commercial launch market. So it's achieved that through disruption, which is a form of innovation that's very critical to the way that we preserve our strength.
And one that is consistent with the underlying political culture of the country. Mm-hmm. It does seem to me that one of America's enormous advantages in the challenge we are facing by China is the genuine risk tolerance of Americans.
Yeah.
Not only are we people who moved into Indian territory, but we're people in one of the wealthiest countries in the world with free vaccines during a pandemic where a third of the country chooses not to take them. That tells you something about risk tolerance, and we need to play to our own actual strengths in this competition. I do, though, want to disagree with you about the U.S. not having a grand strategy on China. And I'm going to point this at you, Tom, because I think not only do we have a grand strategy, we have the right grand strategy, and we've had it for about 35 or 45 years, which is that we created an international order that maximizes the ability of small and middle powers to shape the rules. And as a result, the American-dominated international order isn't just good for us, it's good for others who can help preserve it, but couldn't under any other system have the benefits they have. This is the magnetism of the international order. That is, states benefit most when they opt into the rules of the order, and it maximizes the help we get from others. And I think we have a fabulous current example of this, so what we are trying to do is cajole and coerce China into playing by the existing rules. This Chinese government clearly has rejected that approach, right? It should have been clear from about 2007 that this was the path that China's government was on. It's been evident since at least, even the Obama administration admits they should have seen it by 2014. So one of the things that's interesting about our current moment is you can feel the gears meshing of the government, of the business community, of average Americans like my mom, changing their appreciation of what China is after and beginning to appreciate the importance of preserving the existing order. We have a really interesting creative example of that, of the United States playing team sports with its allies to try and band together, as Keoki suggested, to preserve the existing order. I'm talking about the AUKUS agreement, Thomas. Help us understand what it is, how big are the submarines as a component of it, given that they're not going to be online for a while, and what is the technology cooperation beyond submarines that this means for us?
So AUKUS it seems to be a lot of things in terms of a number of technology sharing aspects to the deal, but the one that certainly has gotten everybody's attention is the pretty unique sharing of, not unique, now it's two countries, nuclear propulsion technology. So previously, the only other country that the U.S. had shared submarine or nuclear propulsion technology with was the United Kingdom, and that was dating back to the 1950s, as we also were grappling with the scale of the challenge that we were going to be involved in. So we've decided to work with the Australians to provide that technology to them as well. I see it being, the deal being driven as kind of a push-pull factors to it, and that one, it was clear to observers that were paying attention to the French-Australian deal moving forward that program wasn't going well. It was delayed. The price of the program in terms of price per ship, I sometimes wondered if I was converting the numbers incorrectly or something. Like it's an astronomical cost for what they were going to get. So there was no surprise there amongst a lot of folks that there was a push away from that program. Then you have a pull based on the geopolitical reality and the military reality in the Western Pacific that maybe that platform wasn't going to work quite so well with the challenge from the Chinese Navy. There might have been a time where conventionally powered diesel electric submarines with relatively limited speed and relatively limited endurance could have made sense against the Chinese Navy that was mostly coastal defense or operating in its near seas. That time has passed. It's very clear that they are well on their way to being a global blue water Navy. And that nuclear propulsion will make a lot more sense for being able to deal with that, because you can't count on just dealing with the PLA Navy close to China anytime in the future. Certainly not 20 years from now. I'm of the opinion that they will have largely wrapped up sea control in 10 or 15 years within certainly the first island chain, maybe the second island chain, with hardly even using their Navy. They'd be mostly a land-based sea power, using missiles, land-based aircraft, and some numbers of smaller escorts for anti-submarine work. So there's a clear military reality that's driving that need for cooperation, and I'm very glad to see it.
Anybody else want to comment on AUKUS?
Yeah, let me just add, I think it really highlights a bigger trend, which is the importance of allies and partners to strategic deterrence for the U.S., to maintaining, freedom of navigation, all these kinds of elements that tie into the rules-based order here. And so when you think about the importance of what Tom just said there, the fact that you have three nations sharing technology, expand that out and think about, what are the considerations for true military interoperability in this phase from competition through crisis to conflict. And so what it highlights is, to me, it's not just about, say, the submarine. It's about the weapon systems. It's about the command and control systems. It's about how do we become, be able to do pickup games, if you will, pre-planned perhaps, to truly interoperate across all of these dimensions. And so I think this is just the first stage of where we're headed.
I agree with that. I really like the DIU director, Michael Brown's notion that we're worried about China having big data because they have a big population. And if we and our allies can find means to cooperate deeply on technology, on data, that we actually have a scale much greater than the Chinese have. But we have to work on this cooperation. We've got to get that piece right. I can think of a couple of interesting, successful examples. I'd be interested if any of the three of you would like to add more. The first is rare earths, which Steve mentioned already. The Japanese got the brunt of China's forward-looking grand strategy in 2010 when, during a minor fishing dispute, China shut off Japan's ability to import rare earths. And the Japanese countered with a fantastic strategy, which is encouraging Chinese to break their own, right? Like small businesses to break the embargo. Second, they invested deeply in Australian mines. And third, they spurred innovation in their own companies to rely less on rare earths. And fourth, they started thinking about how do we create secure supply chains, and the partnership with Australia on that, which all four of those are important, and we need to be thinking in that kind of way. So I love that example. The Department of Energy and the Department of Defense are now reopening mines and processing in the United States, in Wyoming, Texas, and California. Rare earths aren't actually rare. They're just messy, and they're not concentrated. And so we have outsourced, exactly as Steve said, we outsourced to countries that don't have the same level of environmental regulation as we do, and that can do it less expensively. That is a fixable problem.
One of the things
Where do you guys see other places where there are fixable problems that we just need to get our act together and need to work with our allies on this. Steve, you first.
I was just going to add that we have 6 portfolios at the Defense Innovation Unit. The newest one is Advanced Energy and Materials, and there's a growing market of reclaiming, rare earths from just recycling and things like this. So when we talk about the disruption, innovation, and as you say, is that they're only rare if you consider the sources, but there's plenty of resources and how we make use of them. But another comment I wanted to make too, because I will see to you that that there is a grand strategy that's working. When I look at China today, China's very complex, by the way, and especially if you compare the Western provinces to the Eastern provinces. But China looks more like the Western world today than it did, 30 or 40 years ago. So we're winning in that respect. And I think this may be this may be the fuel behind the fire of the authoritarians and who are really trying to grasp and maintain their power base. So I will see that too.
I think that's right. I think at a time where we in the West are questioning whether our values are universal, the people who believe our values are universal run China and Russia.
We're in the business of spending a lot of time with small companies, and the small startup companies in China, they emulate entrepreneurs in the West. They want to be like the Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk types, and so the ecosystem that they're in, through civil military fusion, they have to have some relationship to the army, but it's not really apparent until the army wants what they want. But I think that's really good, and so I think the balancing act is that we want to keep the evolving parts of China that want to be integral parts of the global economy. We want them to grow and build and power and all that stuff. At the same time, we need to kind of curtail the appetite of the authoritarian elements within the CCP, the PLA, who are really trying to disrupt and change the world order. And I think what's happening is the more exposure, the soft power aspect of this is really key. One of the areas where you're going to love this, we have all these projects. So one of them is called XView3, and what we're doing is we're taking commercial imagery and analytics, and we're looking for illegal fishing activity. And the way we're doing it is we're paying, if you're an engineer at Google, you do 14 hours a day of making a web advertisement better. Then you go home, you drink a Jolt, and you start working on interesting problems like one of these challenges that we have. And so what's happening is we have people using publicly available data that are mining, and they're basically highlighting illegal fishing activity, where China is basically decimating the maritime ecosystems around not just Mexico, other places, the Galapagos, all that, but also around North Korea, other things, and it's great. So we're putting a spotlight on those type of things, so that we're hoping that through soft power, that's going to help to curb some of that activity.
I love solutions that use the strengths of free societies to protect free societies, right? Transparency, the rule of law, consensual cooperation, right? Like police having to ask you for your front door surveillance tape to solve crimes, as opposed to without us knowing or consenting doing that. And that's a terrific example of using civil society's voluntary participation, because that's going to be our saving grace, my friends.
And the trust is there, because it's not, in fact, whether it's the Human Rights Watch exposing the Uyghurs and the camps in China,
and ridiculous American celebrities using their Twitter followings to draw attention to these
That's
things.
right.
Like, this is how we win, my friends. But I don't want to stray too far from some of the hard technology and military power problems. And as I mentioned, I've just finished reading Elliot Ackerman's terrific book, 2034. And it happens in the first 20 pages, so I'm not giving anything that ruins the book away, but there's an enormous command and control failure. It's a technology failure on U.S. forces because China has unexpectedly innovated faster than we have. How much sleep do you lose about this problem, and what should we do about it?
Well, yeah, first of all, I think it's important to note this is not a new problem, and we've been grappling with strategic command and control and tactical command and control for a long time through a whole string of technology changes, right, where you're going from, essentially visual signaling to telegraphy to radio RF and so on. And you think about what we had to do, we essentially had to invent strategic command and control at the outset of the Cold War and continually develop that through the technology changes that have led to today. Arguably, there's a huge amount yet to go. I'll say, the amount that we are planning as a nation to spend in the next several years on nuclear command and control and communications, upgrades in particular, is just an illustration of that. But I think the key thing, just highlight, there are a whole lot of ways that command and control can fail. And so one, for example, is cyber threats, right? And so threats that didn't exist or were not fully appreciated some time ago, now essentially this has to be built into any kind of system and actually retrofitted back into existing stuff, right? So that's one example. But we live in a world where we're heavily dependent on space, and here we are across the street from Space Systems Command, right? And if I'm sure for a lot of people, the November 15th Russian ASAT test was a wake-up call. But the reality is that's just one in a long string of publicly recognized tests like that by both Russia and China. And as a nation, broadly speaking, from command and control, we're heavily dependent on space capabilities for almost any warfighting activity. So those are just a couple of examples of sort of the fragility, perhaps, of the systems that we, maybe not fragility in the sense that we have a problem today, but fragility in terms of looking forward over the years to come. You talk about 2034, right? So I would argue that we have a clear and present need to make those investments to deal with resilience. But honestly, that command and control landscape is far broader. And so I'll just rattle off maybe a few things that I think are considerations that would drive those kinds of technology questions that you're asking. So the first is, command and control has to span, it's not just about, we're in crisis, we're in conflict, it has to span everything in that hopefully long lead up. So, improved indications and warnings, using data sources, maybe like you talked about, these are in some cases commercial satellite imagery or other tracking systems, aggregating huge amounts of data that's coming off of commercial platforms to give interesting insights into what is happening in the world. So having a command and control system that covers that span of competition through conflict, including all of the levers that you have to pull, which you need command and control if you're going to have whole of nation solutions that go across economic or diplomatic or political or technological as well as military. That's one. Second is global, right? And our topic today is around the Pacific. I mean, the Pacific is kind of like half the land, or not half the land, but half the area of the Indo-Pacific region, half the area of the world. Huge fraction of the population, huge fraction of the shipping. I mean, so Indo-Pacific is kind of like a global problem to begin with. But then you think about command and control. In globally integrated operations, it's not disconnected from, think about opportunistic scenarios, what's happening in, say, Ukraine versus Taiwan versus the Middle East. And then, of course, the defense of the U.S. homeland. We need to be thinking about command and control that can span all of that. Third thing I'd say is speed. A well-publicized hypersonic test not too long ago over the course of the summer Again, certainly not an isolated instance for either China or Russia. And so that just gives you an idea of the compression of the timelines. But, to use an example, computers operate sort of on nanosecond scales, right? People operate on sort of second scales. So to give you a nanosecond to a second in battle is like a second to 32 years. I mean, think about that. Compression in time there. So this is why capabilities like artificial intelligence that allow you to rapidly develop courses of action, maybe automate courses of action, are so important because of that dramatic change in the time scale of battle. So those are just sort of three examples. And then let me just add resilience, right? And I talked about some of the things that drive lack of resilience. Ultimately, we need to have capabilities that are redundant, reconstitutable, paralyzable. So all of these things are the elements of those future.
What do you mean when you say paralyzable? Why do we want a system that has the ability to be paralyzed?
Well, no, I'm sorry. In parallel, not to be paralyzed. Basically multiple pathways so that if you are, say, jammed or you lose a critical node, you're not completely dead, right? You have that. We don't want to have that paralysis scenario.
So that's, I think, really, really important. One of my favorite books about command and control is the historical example of the Battle of Jutland in World War I. I love Andrew Gordon's book, Rules of the Game, that talks about the descent of Lord Nelson's Navy into the Navy that loses the Battle of Jutland.
Kori, I was literally, while he was talking, I was thinking about what I would say, and I was thinking about that book. I was sitting here thinking about Rules of the Game. That's such a great example. No, I mean, you started talking about it in a great way. I mean, it was when I read that, and there's if you want to go look at this book, like there's a section at the very end, like his 28 lessons learned that he provides from that is just absolute gold for people to look at, to think about, because there's so many parallels to that. That first great power at sea fighting since the guns had fallen silent at Trafalgar, 100 years before. There's a lot of parallels there, and that brittleness that had been inculcated into the British fleet, the fact that the Brits cut all the Germans' overseas communications cables and shut them off from the rest of the world, and we don't have to guess that China was going to do this. I mean, they talk about it quite a lot in their strategic writings, that informationized warfare, that the first thing that happens is they seize information dominance. And people shouldn't confuse that for it's just cyber attacks. Like they talk about, this is kinetic attacks too in their own writings. So this is cratered communication centers, hit by ballistic missiles and all that. So we should be worried about it for sure.
So I want to pull this strain of command and control out into space. Given the heavy reliance, if cables are getting cut and things are exploding in space, how do we build that kind of resilience, Steve?
Well, I think we have a couple things working to our advantage. Just as the Pacific is vast, space is much more vast, and you can't seize territory in space, right? So there's what we just need to design and build things to be more resilient. But I think you talk about the first 20 pages of 2034. I'll just remind everybody that we had our most recent command and control crisis of 2020 when COVID struck. Is we sent all of our defense and intelligence people home and said telework, right? And so that was a major shift in mindset and you appropriately mentioned our willingness to take risks. Well, look, we have to get the work done somehow. I think Americans and Westerners in general are highly adaptable, to changes in the environment. In the 90s, we kind of laugh about it now, but everything was about net-centric, worlds and community, and it's like today it's about decentralized everything. And so and we have history to help guide us. in some of that respects. But here's what's exciting about what's going on in space is that it's with the exception of GPS and some communications capability in geo, it's really pretty much devoid of infrastructure. And one of the neatest projects that we're working on in collaboration with the Space Force and the AFRL is this whole idea of this hybrid space architecture. If you look at what we've learned about the internet and we build an internet in space, what would it look like? And that hybrid architecture would allow you to move information between government and commercial systems, government and government systems, U.S. and allied systems, any combination of that. And how do you build it? Well, you build it using all the state-of-the-art zero trust architecture, which is not how the internet, regular internet, is built on trust, which is violated constantly, right? So zero trust, and you don't try to defend the perimeter, you defend endpoints and make sure that the security. So you have multi-path resilience, so that you basically create something so that it's not like one critical node away from complete destruction or failure. One of the most interesting things to watch evolve right now is the software folks see the world of the internet as Web 2.0 today, which is most of the information comes from very few sources and things like this, and it's hard to have trust and not just content, but also the communications and the integrity of data. The evolution of cryptocurrency, blockchain, all these evolving technologies, which is the Web 3.0, is really the system's reaction to the vulnerabilities today. It's going to be much more difficult to change. And all those technologies are going to completely evolve the way that we do information and currency transactions, everything digitally in the future. So the danger from a national security perspective is that we still have entities in the U.S. government that are working on Windows 95, right? And so so we're very slow to adopt and adapt to new technology. So I think just coming back to COVID and the recognition that we're going to have to abandon some of our best practices from the 80s and 90s and adopt technology that's more adaptive and agile into the future. That's how we're going to ensure that we have C2.
The good news is that China, I recall, just shut down their Bitcoin miners and essentially kicked a lot of them out, and they're moving to Texas, is what I hear.
Well, because they don't like it, right? Because you can't manipulate the currency. You can't manipulate your currency if it's digital. So, yes, you're absolutely right.
Perhaps I'm a saber-toothed tiger gnashing about in a tar pit, but as an old state-centric type, it does seem to me that treasuries are going to figure out how to regulate, tax, and control cryptocurrencies, because why wouldn't they? And that a lot of the churn we are seeing right now as we move forward still does call into question traditional concepts like deterrence. And I want to turn to you, Keoki, for some big thinking about how conceptually do you think we need to either relax constraints on problems, as we have done with the notion of net-centric as the solution, right? We're going to protected to a no-trust concept now. Where are the other conceptual places we need to be thinking fresh?
Well, I think a good place to start is, a lot of our strategic deterrence was built up in this sort of bipolar U.S. Soviet Union world. China is clearly not playing by any of those rules, and just the fact that you have essentially a tripolar world. If you could say the West, Russia, and China, plus some rogue actors. It's just a much more complete, much more complex and dynamic landscape. So I think I'm not saying that requires complete abandonment of some of the principles, but I'm not sure. If you look at what the Russians and the Chinese have done, they are looking at ways that you can essentially operate in the gray zones or move up to the nuclear threshold in ways that that wouldn't necessarily play with the way we conceive of strategic deterrence today. So that's one thing. The second thing is the range of activities we have to deter. And we talked about cyber, obviously, and so it goes beyond that to you talked about essentially exploitation of the global commons, in ways that are not necessarily easily seen. Those are the kinds of things we have to deter. Deter theft of IP and technology, right? And so it's a very interesting landscape when you think about this broader set of global power competition elements that we're thinking about. I don't know that I can offer necessarily that big thinking that you're asking for here, but a couple of thoughts on things that we need, right? So first, I would argue that we actually need a much better analytic framework that would allow us to assess what is deterrent or not, or maybe what is the relative cost of this much of that kind of deterrent, cyber capability versus a kinetic weapon versus investing in a digital currency, right? I mean, those are very different kinds of investments, different kinds of implications. I don't think we have a good analytic framework today to make those kinds of trades. Second thing is probably how do you get to be able to analyze, I'd say in real time or near real time, what is escalatory or de-escalatory from a strategic deterrence perspective. And, we do a lot of work where, or in the past at least, have done a lot of work of looking at different scenarios and essentially having plans in place. But I would argue that we need to have that capability to be able to do this kind of analysis and simulation in real time, right? So having that analytic framework and the tools that go along with it, really important. Having a much more dialable suite of capabilities. And I know you don't like the all of nation approach, but maybe we don't need all of nation, but I'd say there are some pieces that we need to selectively prioritize. And so, some of the things that, from a clear advantages that the U.S. can put pressure on, and we do, things like access to the global financial system. China is actively taking steps to figure out, and other nations, to figure out how to break loose from that. How can we, as a liberal Western order, prevent that from happening, right? So, so those are some of the areas that have technological underpinnings, like we just heard, that we should be going after.
So one specific area where I think China's technological advances and military modernization are causing them the most kind of questioning about whether our concepts are still adequate is China's nuclear modernization. How worried are you about that? How confident are you, Tom, that we have the ideas that can help us manage these advances?
Yeah, it's certainly thrown a huge wrench into the way we thought the nuclear landscape looks. This really dramatic expansion of Chinese nuclear capabilities, although it may not be all nuclear, may be more accurately described as all long range, and probably mostly nuclear, but not necessarily all. So there's a lot of complexity that brings to it, and quite frankly, there's a lot of challenge of scale that it brings to it. I mean, China's clearly not interested in arms control anytime soon with respect to this buildup, and I have a hard time imagining them being so interested until they get to a point of near parity. I mean, if you look in the past, we had the example of kind of the interwar naval limitation treaties where you had Japan accepting a lower, 5 to 3 ratio, and they accepted a smaller fleet. I don't see that happening with China, that anything like that. So I think that's going to be a real challenge to deal with the scale that it appears is going to result. A lot of it is, that challenge is driven by, and to some extent, in terms of maintaining nuclear deterrence, by how we do business and our rule of law. There may be a misperception among some folks that that if we'd cover down on Russia, if we just have a few warheads left for China, that's good enough. We'll just nuke their cities. We don't do that. That's not, law of armed conflict doesn't allow for that. That's not a good enough answer. So I think it is going to bring, there may be the thinking required. There may be, quite frankly, a need to keep production lines running for longer than we're planning to right now, as we proceed with the modernization program, replacing aging systems and aging platforms. So I think at this point, we kind of need to see where things go. I think we're at early days with that expansion. Things move relatively slowly with for us, they at least do, with significant changes in our nuclear arsenal. So I think for now, it's, you know, keep things moving forward, keep a steady hand on the tiller to move forward with the processes or the programs they've got going and see where this goes.
So first of all, I love that you use the example of the Washington Naval Accords, and I'm going to come back to that. But there's a really interesting debate going on right now between, between Robert Work, the former Deputy Secretary of Defense, and Brian McGrath, the naval strategist, and with Bob Work arguing that we need to reduce the demands on our Navy because the Navy's not big enough for all that we are asking it to do. And Brian McGrath countering that he agrees with that, but you shouldn't restrain the supply problem. You shouldn't restrain the demand problem. You should expand the supply. That is, build a bigger Navy if there are more things that are going on. And that's where I circle back to the Washington Naval Accords, because what's so interesting, I wrote a piece for the Naval Institute a little bit ago about the example of innovation, comparing Japan, the United States, and Britain, all three of which were constrained at the 5-to-3 ratio, as Tom mentioned, by the Washington Naval Accords. And Japan and the United States innovated in fabulous, fascinating ways. That is, the birth of carrier aviation comes differently in both, but comes in both. And Britain creates better armor for its warships. That is a dead-end strategy of innovation. So I'd love to ask all three of the panel a question that springboards from that came from our online audience, which is, where should DoD be accepting risk right now in order to spur innovation? So let's start with you, Steve.
Well, full disclosure, right? So I'm an Air Force guy, and I started my first combat deployment in 1990 was a Desert Storm, and so we have tremendous air and space capabilities that all have not been recapitalized since I got in the Air Force. And so I'll tell you where not to do the reduction is in those air and space capabilities. You want the Navy to fly colors and go in and do what it does best. It will need to be fully supported by air and space forces that will literally, crush the ability to counter.
Excellent and non-responsive answer. Where do you take the cuts?
Well, the cuts, I tell you, I would take the cuts out of right now, money is spread peanut butter across the services. And I would, this is not the department's view, this is my view. My view is I would take it from the Army, I would take it from the land component.
I would as well.
And I would take it from our bureaucratic component, because, people don't understand that the department is so huge and the money it goes through. It buys a lot of weapons capability if we had a leaner, more agile Defense Department.
Terrific answers.
I'll probably be fired for that, but
still a free country when last I checked.
That's right.
Tom.
Well, I mean, it's certainly easy to see. Ask the former naval officer what we should do, what part of the DoD we should make smaller when we have a maritime challenge out there. I wouldn't necessarily say just the Army. I would say the Army as we know it, in the sense of a lot of, clearly there's been a necessary focus for decades now on counterterrorism, fighting the wars in Asia. That seems like it's pretty much over, other than some niche capabilities. So what are we doing to, really robustly shift the Army's focus to the Pacific and the very useful things they can do to help out in that theater. I mean, because when I think about what are the things that are vulnerable in that theater, and I think about lots of satellite coverage, kind of the unblinking eye of Sauron over the Earth's surface, combined with AI and pattern recognition. Like, I see the ability for things that aren't hiding in clutter to survive being ever more challenging with much longer range weapons to go with that sensing. So I think there's, we've got people with trucks that can carry things and hide in the jungle and send effects. I think there's a great place for that. So, but that's going to take some really significant change within what the Army values. I mean, I'm not in the Army, but my sense of what the Army values will have to be different than it has been for the last 20 years.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah, interesting you bring up Secretary Work, and I think about places where we should take risk, and there's different kinds of risk, positive risk and negative risk, if you will.
Interesting.
I think, first of all, we do not want to be cutting back on anything that would be asymmetric advantage, right? And so these are places where we need to be doubling and tripling down. So, I would argue that we articulated a great offset strategy, and the Chinese executed it admirably. Or are. And so then what do you go after? And I mean, this is never a fun topic, but there is a lot of, I'd say, aged and outdated material infrastructure that needs to be divested that carries a big sustainment tail. So that's one. Two is there are probably areas, I'd say logistics and sustainment, you got some very smart people who are looking at how to apply advanced technology to take a lot of the cost out of that. This is a place, it's an area that OUSD R&E is very interested in. Those are the kinds of places where we should make investment that would actually save money without hurting force structure.
I should reattack.
Hold on 1 second. When President Biden announced Secretary Austin's selection, he highlighted the fact that, with the pandemic and vaccine distribution, we were going to need somebody good at logistics. And I levitated out of my chair at the idea that the American military is the premier American force in logistics. Because if that's your concern, hire the founder of Amazon. Like, there are a lot of American businesses that are really good at logistics. And the way we have walled off the defense enterprise in so many important areas, from the vibrancy of our commercial economy where these problems are being solved, which goes to the importance of DIU, stitching those connections. But the other thing I really cannot resist, I'm basically the rhinoceros of defense policy, right? They're nature's firemen. They go tramp it. And I want to stamp out the emergent fire that it's okay not to have a defense bill passed by Congress because continuing resolutions are good enough. Because that is so fundamentally untrue. Because it doesn't permit the prioritization that all three of you were talking about. It doesn't permit starting of new contracts, and it creates a dysfunctional laziness where Congress doesn't take responsibility for the fact that they actually run American defense policy. We really, really need to return to the discipline of Congress setting priorities and funding those priorities, because otherwise, my friends, we lose this competition and we will be in a less secure, less prosperous state. So thank you for indulging that, and blame Sam, who told me I could editorialize on these things. We have time for just one or two more questions that our audience have put through. This one for you, maybe, Tom. How should DoD think about leveraging R&D capabilities of the Quad? And I'm going to want to hear your answer to this as well, Keoki.
Well, I mean, there's certainly things that our allies do that they seem to be very good at. I can think, for example, one thing in mine warfare. Unfortunately, the Navy's mine warfare program has really struggled mine countermeasures for the last decade or so. The Europeans seem to be really good at it. And I think this is an area where we can really use some help. It's a very, very small portion of the Navy's. When I did the math, it was less than 1% of the Navy's procurement spending, remembering that I think something like 80% of the warships we've had damaged since World War II were damaged by mines. So anyways, so hopefully some help there. I think in shipbuilding, maybe we can get some help from our allies. You know, if you look at the commercial sector, you know, China's merchant shipbuilding, they're the world's largest shipbuilders now. They built 38 million tons of commercial shipping in 2020. We built 70,000 tons of commercial shipping.
Right.
But there still remain very large, robust shipbuilding industries in South Korea and Japan. So I worry about our basically Navy-only shipbuilding base over time losing the fact that it doesn't have a lot of competition. You know, maybe helping out with getting some ideas from those industries.
And Steve, I cut you off before, so please pick up where you were going to and connect it to this.
Oh my gosh, I lost my train of thought, but that's okay. I think I know, on the budget issue, and here's a real tough problem. What you need to do when you look at the defense budget is you really need to look at the must-pays. And most people think that we have a very large chunk of the budget going to solving the problems that we're talking about on the stage, but that's not really the case. The must-pays is really, you know, personnel, infrastructure. Yeah, we talk. Do you know all the real estate? You know, real estate that the DoD holds on to, all this stuff, and so.
We have the same problem in the defense budget that the federal budget has writ large.
Exactly.
Because entitlements are crowding out discretionary spending.
Right, and so I'm not saying do away with it, but you have to. It doesn't matter which party or what leader you are. You show up on day one of your job, and the first thing you realize is we have all these must pays that consume the vast majority of those resources. But I think that's important. How we embrace innovation. You know, the best we talked about, you know, Soren's eye, but basically all the commercial capabilities to stare at the Earth. You know, 90% of what we know about climate change we know from space. Did you know that? If you think about observing the Earth from space, that's how we know most of what we know about climate change. But if you want to get early indications and warning of nefarious activity, develop the algorithms to give you that. And when you have early indications, you have better ability to respond diplomatically, lower the temperature of conflict. And so I think the information and the transparency is going to be a key part of the strategy going forward.
It's a great point. Dr. Jackson, I am going to give you the last word, my friend. What is the conclusion that you would like the participants in this conversation to take away?
Yeah, I really want to, this kind of goes to the theme of allies and partners, but I'd say equally to this question of joint. And I'd like to tie together these themes of deterrence, technology, command and control. Ultimately, you know, things like joint all-domain command and control, we know this is where we need to get to. I think this is a case, you know, to quote the Rolling Stones, right? You can't always get what you want. If you try sometimes, you might get what you need. We got to decide what we really need, and then we need to do it fast. And so really keeping the focus and the clearly articulated sense of urgency that you're getting from INDOPACOM, from the commander, from all of the components there, that we need to demonstrate deterrent capability and create dilemmas every day and use every exercise and every demonstration as part of that deterrent equation. That means that we need to be rapidly bringing in these prototypes and experiments. We need to accelerate these campaigns of experimentation. We need to bring our allies and partners into those even more actively, so that we are, you know, utilizing that best capability of innovation from the United States and our partners. And we need to do it fast. You know, all of this needs to tie back to not just running experiments, but then driving rapid acquisition so that we are delivering capability in, you know, single-digit years, not single-digit decades, right?
Excellent point to end on. I now pass the con to my friend and colleague, the leader of Breaking Defense, Aaron Maida. But before his panel takes up, we are going to take a 5-minute break. So we'll see you back after that. Thank you, my friends. This was a great education.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kori.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am going to briefly introduce our virtual keynote remarks. I also want to thank the first panel for a really great conversation. It was part tackling technology competition, this issue, as well as it was part book club, I thought. I made several notes of books that I'm excited to read this year that were recommended by the panel. As I mentioned earlier, Vice Admiral John Hill, the director of the Missile Defense Agency, was unable to join today. However, he wanted to participate, so he recorded comments for this event in advance. We thank Admiral Hill for taking the time to do this, and we can start his comments now.
Well, good morning, and really appreciate the opportunity to provide you this update on missile defense challenges, specifically tied to competition in the Pacific. I'd like to thank Aerospace and the MITRE corporations for the invitation. I would rather be in El Segundo, California today, but unfortunately I could not get out to the West Coast this week. So I know that the forum is going to be great this week, and I appreciate, again, this opportunity to talk to you about missile defense. So we can go ahead and change the charts, please. I like to start every briefing we do discussing the threat. This chart was sourced from the 2019 Missile Defense Review. And what I like about it, it's an unclassified way to talk about the major parameters that are a challenge to us. It was a challenge back in 2019, remains a growing challenge today. In the upper left is the ranges for intercontinental ballistic missiles. You can see the short range, the medium range, and intermediate range, as if we were launching from Maine out to the Pacific. You can kind of see the reach by looking at that. So range has always been an issue, because depending on the type of threat that's coming in at those different ranges could affect the end-game speed, which makes a threat a major challenge. So I'm going to kind of drop anchor a little bit on speed. In the lower left, you can see the differences between, what I grew up with, subsonic and supersonic cruise missiles, now into this world of hypersonics, because it's in the news today. And you can see the Mach numbers, and then in miles per hour, the really stunning amount of speeds. And, what does that really do to an architecture that's designed for defense? It really is a challenge for our sensors. So that's speed. In the upper right, it kind of shows you how the offensive systems are actually just evolving over time. We used to really think about, from a ballistic missile defense perspective, what it means to deal with countermeasures and other penetration aids and decoys in space, and what that would mean for a sensor system that had to ferret through all of that to get to the lethal object. What we're really dealing with now is more of the re-entry vehicles coming in. So you see the MIRVs there, depressed trajectories, which really means speed. Now you've got a hypersonic ballistic missile coming in. Maneuvering re-entry vehicles adds to the complexity of that scene. And then the global hypersonic threat. And what do I mean by global? Well, a hypersonic, because it is maneuvering in the glide phase, you can kind of see those two different trajectories there in the center of the chart. It can get to global coverage, meaning that it could evade sensors, and we could find ourselves surprised when they finally do dip back into the atmosphere. And then, of course, you have the long-range cruise missile issues. So I'll assert for you today that the threat has really evolved to a point to where it's really about speed and precision. That is what is how I would summarize that. If you'd have talked to me 3 or 4 years ago, I would have said the advent of countermeasures, increasing types of countermeasures, whether they're against the IR field or the RF, or if they're jammer type of decoys and those sorts of things. It's really about speed and maneuver now. That is really what we're dealing with today. And you can kind of see the rogue nations across the bottom of the chart. Then, of course, the pacing threat, as the Secretary of Defense has described China in the lower right. Next chart, please. So these are just a few items from the news, because I tell you, you can't pick up a newspaper today or go online and read the news about global events without seeing a number of tests that are being conducted by near peers, whether it's China or Russia. You see the rogue nations even moving into hypersonic testing. It's in the unclassified press that North Korea has tried its hand at hypersonic missiles. So that's the speed and maneuver aspects are really becoming, kind of the big issue for us as we move downstream for protecting the country. Next chart, please. So I want to talk a little bit about our mission. So when you see at the top of the chart that, the three big takeaways for the mission statement for the Missile Defense Agency is it's a layered missile defense system. We're to defend the United States, deployed forces, allies, and friends in all phases of flight. And so we do that by basically following the wheel around the corner here. If you go to the bottom, we're starting off with technology. We're figuring how that goes in, what gaps need to be closed in the development. We get to production and fielding, and then we support the services and operations readiness. At the end of the day, it is all about delivering capability to the warfighter. So those of you who have tracked the evolution of the Missile Defense Agency from our days as a strategic defense initiative, as we came through a ballistic missile defense organization to now an agency that's focused on development and delivery to the warfighter, you know that we started against the ballistic threat. We have been directed to take on the hypersonic missile threat. And then, of course, there is the strategic cruise missile threat that's out there. At the end of the day, they all converge. They're delivering very high-speed warheads, and they're coming in with precision and with large numbers. And that's a challenge against any defensive system. So I'm going to talk more about that as we go through. Next chart, please. This is an update to what I normally call the placemat. And it gives you kind of a sense from a detection to control and engage framework that I often will talk about. So it really does start with sensing, and you can see some of the big sensors that we have to the left. You see the space sensors at the top. You see our sea-based X-band radar. You see the transportable TPY-2s. You see the Aegis ships. You see the transportable THAAD and the Patriot. They all come with sensor systems with them because that's where you really start, right? You have to have indications and warning. You really do have to form a track. You have to have fire control quality data with very low latency that's going to the engagement systems along the bottom of the chart. But none of that happens unless you've got rock solid command and control and that the warfighter's got its interface into the system. And generally that is done through the command control battle management communication systems, or what we call C2BMC. That is how we network together our sensors. It's how we combine the data, how we get that tracking information to the systems below. From a homeland defense, another three-way framework here is to look at it in terms of three battles. So we look at homeland defense, GBI, that is its bread and butter. That is what the GBI system is designed and fielded to do. And so if you move into the regional systems, Aegis ships, Aegis ashore with various versions of standard missile, and then the Theater High Altitude Air Defense System with the Army, the THAAD system. You see the SM-6 and sea-based terminal on board the ships today, and then the Patriot system with its MSE, and as it moves into the IBCS system into the future. Connecting all those together so that the warfighter can prosecute the defensive capability this nation brings forward really is the key to what we do at the Missile Defense Agency. Okay, next chart, please. I'd like to talk a little bit about space. The reason I kind of focused in on speed and maneuver and talked about the global threat is the obvious answer is that if a threat can overfly, underfly, or go around a sensor architecture, then really the way to deal with it is to have your sensing capability in space looking down. Pretty challenging because now you're looking at warm threats on a warm globe, and you have to be able to pull those tracks out of the clutter. We do have the capability to do that, and we'll be deploying something in the center of the chart called HBTSS, the Hypersonic Ballistic Tracking Sensor, in FY23, so that we can take what we've learned on the ground, deploy it to space, two different companies, interoperable, and then tying into the broader space architecture. We already have the space-based kill assessment deployed today to the right, and we're working with Northern Command to go from hit assessment to an actual kill assessment. And that's all part of taking that system into full operations. So you can kind of see that we do operate in space, particularly when it comes to ballistic missiles, and then we're going to operate in the atmosphere and deal with the high maneuver. But the earlier that we engage, the better. And you see the hypersonic, a representative threat there coming across the center, and that glide phase is what we're addressing today, because we do have terminal capability But in order to get to the layered defense, as I stated in the mission earlier, we need to crawl back on that trajectory and take it out earlier so that we have a better chance of survival. Okay, next chart, please. So I want to kind of give you a little bit of a concept for hypersonic missile defense, and this singular chart to do this. If you're interested in a little bit more, we do have a video that's available on the unclassified side. You can find it on YouTube. You can contact Public Affairs here at the Missile Defense Agency, and it kind of walks you through our overall concept. I mentioned that sea-based terminal, the SM-6 missile, is already deployed on Aegis ships today to protect the sea base, and it is designed against the high maneuvering target in the atmosphere. And so that capability exists now and is proliferating across the fleet. There is potential to take that capability and move it to the land base to protect some of our assets ashore. So we're working through that. But if you look at the representative threat launching from the right, there's that ballistic phase in one version of this hypersonic threat. Then there is the glide phase. And I mentioned on the left side that we engage now in the terminal phase with SM-6. What we want to do is get to the glide phase intercept. So we've awarded 3 contracts this month, and we are now doing our industry discussions, and we will assess and really lock down our requirements as we move into a glide phase interceptor. And you'll see that the glide phase interceptor does exactly what we're doing sea-based terminal, which is we're leveraging the inherent engage on remote and launch on remote capability. What I mean is off-board sensors feeding the fire control on board Aegis ships today. We're going to do the same thing for glide phase intercepts, to where we can leverage the sensing capability that exists right now today in order to launch a weapon against the glide phase, and then it just becomes more effective as soon as we proliferate the space capability to track with low latency, with the kind of covariance that we need for targeting and threat track. And you'll see the connectivity there through C2BMC, and you can see that hypersonic ballistic tracking space sensor at the top of the chart. So this is the layered defense view that we have against these threats. And if you imagine an air launch version of a hypersonic missile, you imagine something that comes out of space and into the glide phase. If you're in a region where these are targeting you, this is the layered defense concept we have in place. Again, SM-6 capability on Aegis ships, sea-based terminal, and incremental improvements, along with the glide phase interceptor coming soon. Okay, next chart, please. I recently talked to a forum where we got into the discussion about artificial intelligence and machine learning. A lot of what I said earlier when I mentioned speed and maneuver kind of being the challenges of the day, is enabled. Our ability to react to that and to defend against that really is handled through machine learning and artificial intelligence. We have some basic views of that already in our systems today. But it crosses the span from planning to the detect, track, and discriminate. Discriminate's our word for picking out that lethal object that I mentioned earlier. The command and control that I talked about before, and then the engagement systems, and then assessing how well we've done on that engagement is really what this chart speaks to. These are some areas where we can leverage that, and where we are assessing different types of artificial intelligence and machine learning to speed up those processes. And I think that it's very promising. And again, we do have a lot of that incorporated today. We'll just continue to improve it as we go. Okay, next chart. And as a way to kind of wrap this up, I wanted to talk to you about a little bit about how programs are affected, just to kind of put it into context as to why it's challenging to get systems out the door as quickly as possible. Right, so I mentioned the hypersonic and missile tracking capability. That's up in the upper left there. The glide phase defeat down on the left, initially going to be done in the sea base and then transferable to the land-based batteries. We didn't talk a whole lot about the next generation interceptor. That is the next version of the ground-based interceptors that are deployed today. And I did talk about the transportability of that and Patriot in the future. So what's really important, and why I started with threat at the beginning, is it's constantly evolving. And we should all acknowledge that that's not going to change. It's going to continue to evolve. So all of these systems that are on this chart and that I showed you earlier have to be constantly upgraded. And that's an important thing. You got to evolve with them, right? The combatant commands and the services are always going to have a sense of urgency to go do that. right? So I'm asked, I would say on a daily basis, what can you do to speed up this capability? And we're going to do that. And we're going to work across the joint environment, across the cross-service and the cross-agency piece. We have to stay honest with ourselves, and we have to be honest with Congress on how we're doing. We have to take care of our industrial base. And I would tell you, it's a huge challenge on where we are today, particularly with a global pandemic and shortages of different piece parts that I'm sure you'll talk about this week. But that's important to us, right? So we watch the mergers and the acquisitions. We work very closely with industry to understand the impacts to programs. We're constantly assessing our technical maturity and our risk. Cost schedule, technical risk, of course, that's a classic program manager's issue. We want to make sure we leverage competition, and we normally do that for speed. One of the reasons why we competed GMD and the Next Generation Interceptor in the upper right was to go as fast as we could go to get to our first emplacement, to make sure that the country is protected. Working closely with allies and partners, that is really key when we take a look at what the pacing threat is in the future. We're not going to be able to do it alone. So we do a lot of outreach, and we have a lot of programs with our allies and partners. And then every now and then we have to come back in and take a look at our contract approaches to make sure we've got as much efficiency as possible, and that we are, again, coming through and being honest with ourselves and leveraging the oversight that we have to get our programs across the finish line and get them deployed so that we can continuously upgrade them. Okay, enough on that chart. I'm going to go into a wrap. Next chart, please. Just to repeat again, Missile Defense Agency's #1 priority is delivering capability to the warfighter. That's what I'm focused on every morning. That's why it's great to be a part of the Missile Defense Agency. The men and women here, you see it on the chart, stellar team. We have a noble mission. It's very simple. There is no mystery as to what we're focused on when we wake up in the morning. It's about missile defense and delivering that capability to the warfighter. Okay, I'd like to thank Aerospace and the MITRE corporations again for inviting me to provide this keynote. I really wish I could have been there in person in El Segundo, but I hope that I answered some of the questions that may be in your mind today. You're going to have a great conference, the ability to talk about these things. I'll look forward to the next time that we speak. Thank you again for your time, and take good care.
Okay, now for our last panel. This one is on the missile competition in the Pacific. And we have Aaron Mehta here today, the editor-in-chief of Breaking Defense, to help us navigate this discussion. And as many of you know, before transitioning to editor, Aaron was a longtime defense reporter. And I would just say, from my perspective as someone who has researched missile issues for a long time, that I always looked for everything that Aaron wrote. Anything that Aaron covered on this topic, I always thought was both insightful and clarifying on issues that are anything but clear. So thank you, Aaron, and I will turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Sam. That's very flattering. The check is in the mail, as they say. Wanted to thank Aerospace and MITRE for inviting me to take part in this panel, which I think is, if you want to talk about brain power or star power, I think we're pretty well covered here. To my right is Patty Jane Geller, who is the policy analyst with the Nuclear Deterrence and Missile Defense subjects at Heritage. To my left, Dr. Laura Greco, who is currently at MIT, also has a long-standing relationship with the Union of Concerned Scientists. And to her left, Dr. Craig Lindsay, who is the General Manager for Space Systems in Architect Division at the Aerospace Corporation. We're going to eschew any sort of opening comments because we want to get right into the discussion. And the first question that I think needs to be addressed is kind of, which was addressed slightly by Admiral Hill in his comments, the MDA director, before this. Some people are talking about hypersonic weapons as a game changer, as something that breaks the strategic defenses of America, that changes the strategic competition with China. You talk to other people and they say, yeah, hypersonic weapons are nice and flashy and they're cool new technology, and really they don't actually change anything. Our strategy remains essentially the same. They're just kind of the new it factor. And the thing that I've, as a journalist who dabbles in these things and comes in and out and doesn't have the technical background that obviously my compatriots up here do, what I find myself wondering a lot is the question of, why is this confusing? This seems like it should have a pretty straightforward, clear answer. Are these game-changing or are they not game-changing? And I guess, Patty, maybe we'll start with you. Why is this debate about hypersonic weapons just so confusing?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me on the panel, and thanks to Aerospace for having me here. I guess I'll start. I think the debate over hypersonics and what they are is confusing in general just because of the term we use to describe these missiles, hypersonic weapons. Hypersonic technically means a missile can go at least 5 times the speed of sound. But that's not a new technology. Our ballistic missiles that we've been used to dealing with can go that fast when they're descending back towards the Earth. But what's different with hypersonic missiles, that's what we're referring to, is that they can go that fast, but they are not on the usual predictable ballistic missile trajectories that we know. They can either fly at the edge of the atmosphere or cruise at lower altitudes, and are also able to maneuver during flight. So that's what's new about the challenge that we're dealing with. And I wouldn't necessarily say that hypersonic missiles are a game-changing or a breakthrough technology. I think it's just we've learned how to make these cruise missiles go faster. But I think there are 2 main things that are important that we need to consider when we talk about the hypersonics debate. And the first is when we look at what our adversaries, Russia and especially China, are doing, they're developing, deploying new sort of hypersonic technologies. It shows us their intent, China's intent to get ahead militarily. This is something that should be waking us up in the U.S. and looking at and seeing all that they're doing. And the second thing is that hypersonics, they do present a new challenge for the United States to handle because because of their ability to go so fast and maneuver, they're much more difficult to track and to sense. And we heard Admiral Hill talk about all of the things that the Missile Defense Agency is doing. We're working on the space sensor layer, for example, to improve our tracking and sensing capabilities. But missile warning and tracking is so important because we need to be able to see the threat before we have any chance of not only interception, but organizing a retaliatory response as well. So this is a new challenge that the U.S. just has to figure out how to manage, both on the battlefield and I think strategically as well.
You use both hypersonic and hypersonic weapons, which is another point that you just sometimes see bandied around, is what do we actually call these things even? Steve Trimble, the wonderful reporter for Aviation Week, has been at war with anyone who dares say hypersonics, which I often do. Laura, where do you come down on this question? I guess, again, why is this confusing? And are we talking about these things in the correct way?
Thanks, Aaron, and thanks to Aerospace for having me come give an outside of the Beltway perspective. On my flight here, everyone was talking about the Army, and I realized it was all K-pop fans coming for the BTS concert. Probably your flights from Washington were for the Reagan Defense Forum, but I was, anyway. That's
a little bit of a different world.
Totally different world. Yes, this hypersonic weapon debate, I think it's confusing for a few reasons. One is, the question is this old or new technology? And it is posited as new, and of course there's a lot more investment in it than there was, but the U.S. Did a lot of research and development on this in the 1960s and didn't really identify a specific mission for it and went forward with other technology developments. So it is old and new at the same time. Of course, we all know there's a lot of what people call hyper-hype, which is really describing the capabilities incorrectly. And I think that's muddied the debate. There's a lot of talk about it being faster. And really on all relevant, distance scales, they're not faster or much faster than ballistic missiles. They're, in fact, they start at the same speeds if they're launched by ballistic missiles. But so it isn't a decisive advantage in that way. They've been described as being invisible. You can't see them. Well, of course, you can see the launch. The United States will not miss a launch of any kind of missile. And in fact, especially at long distances, they will generate enormous amounts of heat as they're going through the atmosphere, and that can be detected by our infrared sensors. So while our sensor systems have been tailored to look for ballistic missiles and are not well suited to this technology, it doesn't mean that they're invisible. And then the other part of this is they're maneuverable. You can't see where they're coming from. And again, there are existing, maneuverable ballistic missiles or their warheads. So, it occupies a small part of this parameter space, which is slightly different, but it isn't really new. It isn't decisively different. So I think it makes it difficult to have a technically based conversation about what are they for. And in the United States, the pursuit is really for different things. than Russia or China are pursuing them for, that also muddies the debate because they're not for the same part of the strategy. So the whole conversation around the technology, the strategy, are all sort of shifting, and it's made it, I think, really difficult to have like a thoughtful, informed conversation about it.
Before we get to Craig on this question, let me just, the point you just raised about how they're used for different things in the U.S. versus China and Russia. Can you just give a quick primer on how you look at that?
Well, at least for, you know, what we think that the intercontinental range hypersonic missiles that a country like Russia or China would be interested in pursuing would be to get around U.S. ballistic missile defenses and to convince the United States that it can evade missile defenses. And there's lots of strategies for trying to do that. The United States doesn't need to do that for Russia or China. They don't field any sort of comprehensive ballistic missile defense at this point. So the United States is not pursuing intercontinental range, nuclear-armed hypersonic missiles. In fact, the U.S. programs right now are all conventional. And so those are different. I think there may be more overlap on the theater and regional range hypersonic, but in terms of sort of the strategic range, they're looked at really differently.
Got it. Craig, I guess the first question obviously is which member of BTS you're a fan of, but moving beyond that, I suppose, again, this question of why this is so confusing, and even if I guess the bigger question in some ways is, are we talking about these correctly? Not just when we talk amongst ourselves as people who deal with this day to day, but when we talk about them to the public.
All right. Well, first of all, appreciate both Aerospace and my MITRE colleagues for the opportunity to be here today. I'm primarily a technologist, so I'm looking at it from the technology perspective. But I would say that really to start off on why things are so confusing, really goes back to we often talk about the technology from the what are we going to do about it perspective, but we also need to get down to the what are they, what do they represent to your point, and what can we do about it, which really leans more towards the strategy part of the element and trying to settle some of those basic discussions on strategies once we recognize or come to some agreement on what they are. We actually spent some time, and I think Sam and some others put out a paper on this, which is really the hypersonic missile debate that's out there, just to try to pull on that. We just obviously heard different dimensions just in this discussion just a moment ago about whether they're new or not. We're talking about things that are fast and maneuverable. We've had fast, we've had maneuverable. We're getting fast and maneuverable at the same time. Range can certainly be an issue in this debate also as to what they represent. So a lot of this really goes back to what do we think they really are? What type of threat do we really recognize them as? And also the context, strategic versus theater, really matters in this range. So trying to decompose it a little bit into just some principles of agreement on what it is, what we're going to do, and what we might do about it would probably really help before we get too far into all the technology that's going to be involved in either trying to counter or deal with those threats.
You know, one of the questions that I think we've just heard a little bit of from everyone is this question of theater versus strategic. And I think that's actually an important maybe starting point for this question. Are these weapons that are more important for a strategic level or more important for a tactical level? Is there a way to differentiate that? Pat James, maybe you can start in this one. And the reason I bring this up is partly because I was having a conversation with somebody who deals with this, and this is in the wake of the Chinese test. And the argument that was made to me was, yes, this is a notable thing. It's notable they were able to do this, but the big concern is still that these things could be at a conventional level used to take out ships so quickly before we could ever respond. And while the strategic stuff is important, it's not actually much different, because we've heard from the ICBM issues that have already existed. So I guess, Pat James, I'm wondering where you come on the question of strategic versus theater level.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think I agree that the more kind of immediate pressing problem are conventional hypersonic weapons threats, just because we know that conflict is probably likelier to start at a regional conventional level, and we need to be able to deter, defend against Russian and Chinese, the new threat of the combination of speed and maneuverability. And then I will make one note that there is another issue with this question, is that Russia and China, they are also, their regional or theater hypersonic weapons are also dual capable and can carry nuclear weapons, which kind of complicates things a bit in my view, especially because the U.S. doesn't have the same sort of regional nuclear capabilities to have a credible deterrence against Russia's and China's improving arsenals of regional nuclear weapons. So I think that's one problem that the U.S. is going to have to contend with over time. When we talk about strategic hypersonic weapons, I assume you might mean like the Russian avant-garde or...
Yeah, something that, essentially that, I guess the question is almost more the homeland protection versus theater level conflict.
Right. So when it comes to strategic hypersonic weapons, it is true that we already can't defend, and it's not our policy to defend the homeland from Russian and Chinese massive arsenals. But I do think that strategic hypersonic weapons still pose an issue. If we can't track and sense where they're going, even if they're coming to the homeland, that still creates a problem and complicates U.S. deterrence, I think. I think the China FOBs, or the big test we're all talking about, has implications. I'm sure we'll get to that more specifically. But yeah, so I think there are certainly challenges both strategically and regionally. But I think, regional is probably the more pressing problem. I would be curious.
Hey, Laura, do you want to just jump in?
I don't have a lot of expertise on the regional question. My intuition is that it is certainly a more pressing problem, and it's probably more easily solved with defenses, since you're defending a smaller, if you are defending carriers or Guam or someplace that's, you're not trying to defend an entire continent or large country. My guess is that's easier to solve, and in those, in the regional systems, the speeds are not as high, and these ships are equipped to do that. I guess for the strategic hypersonic missiles, we can certainly pinpoint where they came from and generally where they're going, I think, probably with existing technology, and I'll defer to your expertise on that architecture, but I don't think I think it would be impossible to not know where the sending address was and the general region of where they would be delivered to, but not well enough perhaps to defend against them. But again, as Patty Jane said, we're already not defending against the large Russian and Chinese arsenals, so it doesn't materially change that situation. It probably complicates it, but it isn't a game changer in that sense.
Yeah, Craig, why don't you weigh in a little bit on the technical aspect here, both in terms of theory level versus homeland defense level, the capabilities and technologically kind of where the U.S. is and how it deals with these things.
Right. Obviously, when it comes down to the debate of theater versus strategic, I think we've made a lot of great points here on where we're more likely to see some of these threats, but it's really hard to eliminate strategic concerns. This really goes back to our ability to detect and characterize these threats. So there is potential for misunderstanding of these threats. We don't know where they're going necessarily. We may not know where they're going. There may be some gaps out there. We can't really afford to leave our leadership in a position where they've got that ambiguity dealing with those timelines, whether that's a theater commander or whether that's a national commander out there. So I think when I look at the strategic versus theater debate, it's really coming down to do we have clarity at the time of the event as to what we're actually dealing with, then tying it back to what's our strategy for dealing with it and making sure that we have an appropriate response. The stakes can be high. There's a lot of newness here, and obviously you're hearing a lot of concern that's being expressed, and this is really a time to basically put measures in place to make sure we have the clarity as to what's going on, and don't miscalculate and have a mistake as to whether it's a strategic theater. Both of them need the information. They'll be supported, obviously, for defense purposes in theater. There's obviously a national debate that will ensue as to what we're going to do about it, whether it's any different than ballistic, and that will ensue. But we at least need to get the clarity on these events.
Do you think we can have that clarity now?
It's really hard for me to jump into that topic as to where the clarity is or is not. But it just puts more pressure on and just raises the importance of making sure that we've got the right kind of capabilities in place.
So one issue that was mentioned up here is the recent Chinese hypersonic test. I should say recently revealed. It happened in July. It was reported, I believe, late October was the first mention in the press of it. And there's been obviously some follow-up reporting as well. I would just throw out that some great analysis has happened on breakingdefense.com regarding that issue if you'd like to go check that out. But regardless, literally phrases like game changer and the big one, Sputnik moment, have been thrown around regarding this test. Before we get into the details of this, I'm going to put the panelists on the spot here. I didn't tell them I was going to do this, so I apologize. Yes or no, is this a game-changing Sputnik moment, in your opinion?
My answer is more complicated than
yes or no.
My answer is whether it's a Sputnik moment is I think if the longer the U.S. takes to debate whether or not we can classify this test as something that fits a historical event, by that time China will have tested something new. So I don't necessarily think the technology fits as a Sputnik moment. The FOBs and hypersonic technologies that China tested are not new or like Sputnik was at the time, but I still think this test is quite significant for its own reasons when we look at it for what it is. And if you could come back to me.
We'll go into detail, I promise.
Yeah.
Laura, I'll try to get a yes or no, but it's probably a failing. No? Okay, there we go. I like that.
Well, that came too quickly to me. I'm still trying to figure out what would be a good response to this. I would lean more towards yes. You're obviously hearing a lot of the leadership, and I'm not just basically mirroring what they are saying, but this, when you get into things that are new, you really have to go back and reevaluate your strategies. So that's it. Whether it's Sputnik or something less than Sputnik, that's arguable, but it is certainly a reason to pause and just make sure that we got the right force structure in place.
All right, Laura, since you gave the most strongest single word response, you get to lead off the question of kind of why is it not then a Sputnik moment, as we've heard. Again, these are phrases that military officials on record are now using when talking about it.
Right. Well, okay. I only have the information that I have no inside information, so I can only base that off of what has been described.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's hard for me to reconcile what was described with the description of it as a Sputnik moment or something that was a game changer. So I guess I'm saying a provisional no with the information I have. It seems like we certainly know that China is well capable in space and can launch, all sorts of things. We also know China has had a lot of ambitions and public ambitions and publishes in the open literature and includes these craft in their military parades. So it's not like we did not know that China is pursuing hypersonic missiles. And I don't know what the pairing of those two technologies meant. I mean, there are a number of explanations just with the few facts we have. One could be that China needed to test its longer range hypersonic missile, and this was putting it into orbit first was the best way to instrument it and get a long range and to see how it performed. And that would be part of a regular technology development process. That seems a little strange for me to have such strong reactions inside the government for something like that, but I don't know. The fact that something was put into space and then deorbited is a technology that is well developed, has been well developed for a long time.
Back to the 60s, right?
Yes, and I mean, there's more gentle ways and less gentle ways of deorbiting something to the ground. We certainly drop things in capsules into the ocean or with parachutes, or we have beautiful, exquisite systems that can land on a runway. And those are much harder, of course. But that's what the space shuttle did. That's what the X-37B does, and China is pursuing its own technologies to do that. So that's when China was repeatedly describing this technology demonstration as a reusable space technology demonstration. Again, it wasn't clear they're talking about the same tests, or whether they're being obtuse about it and refusing to engage on this actual technology demonstration or whether that's what it was described as. I don't know how it was meant to be landed. If it was trying to land on a runway, you would not be carrying a nuclear weapon and landing it on a runway. So if it tried to land on a runway, that would probably give some credence to the idea that this was reusable. If it crash landed, well, okay, then it might have been a failed runway experiment, or it might have been something, trying to generate the force of kinetic impact as its weapon. It was described by officials as nuclear capable, but I really never saw any evidence why it was described that way. Could it carry the load, as much as China's smallest nuclear weapon that we know about, or was it really associated with a part of the defense establishment that was associated with nuclear weapons? I don't know why it was described that way. But the pairing of something into space, coming back down and gliding is equally descriptive of lots of things. So to call it a game-changing moment seemed to me to really lack an enormous part of the context. So I was unwilling to take that at face value. I'm a little skeptical without more information that this is something that qualifies as a game changer. And again, the piece of it, if it's just FOBs, well, putting something into space and bringing it back down again is not all that, it's really old. So anyone can test that at any time, and why would you call it a FOBs rather than I'm deorbiting my spacecraft? I'm not really sure.
Yeah, one of the general officers from the Space Force this week did specifically say that they looked at this as a FOBs item. So again, that's a capability that the U.S. has had for decades. Right. Which, do you have more?
We can get that. We can get going. Yeah, but FOBs is interesting. So again, if we're talking about strategy, FOBs, of course, is a strategy that countries have used and the Soviet Union used to try to get around a deployed U.S. missile defense system. And once that missile defense system disappeared, so did FOBs. And it's a very awkward system because the Outer Space Treaty, and almost everybody's an adherent to the Outer Space Treaty. One of the hardest and fastest rules in that is that you are not allowed to station nuclear weapons in space, in orbit or any other way. I don't know other ways besides orbit, but you can't put them up there. So, and there was this legal analysis which said as long as it doesn't complete one orbit, we're okay with not calling it being placed in orbit. So you make it go around and come back down one time. So that's sort of the FOBs strategy, and it allows your craft to go much longer and from an unpredictable direction. So it's really associated, it has been historically associated with avoiding missile defenses. But the technology itself is, I'm not sure how accurate a FOBs is compared to other delivery systems. I don't have that expertise and I haven't looked at it, but whether it's comparable to using their ballistic missiles, whether it's better or different or worse, I don't actually know. But as a strategy, it says to me that China is looking at not just missile defenses, but the suite of technologies the U.S. is fielding to negate China's nuclear weapons. This is sort of evidence that that's sort of what they're doing.
Kori, do you want to jump in on the question of the implications here for U.S. missile defenses?
Well, I think obviously there's been a lot of history in this area, as Laura points out. When you take a look at the implications of any kind of going back to a change here, obviously a lot of the debate previously has been about ballistics and what to do with ballistics when it comes to the homeland. And even if you take a look at the argument when we talk about these missiles, they'll still end up in this ballistic construct, but it's the maneuvering and speed that becomes a little bit more of the issue. And obviously we have satellites that are deorbited. You can see the ambiguity that we have when we deorbit a satellite as to when it's going to deorbit and where. So it's not easy. The better you get at that, the more a concern we should have in your ability to, particularly if it's, however it's controlled to do that. So it's certainly a concern that we, when we've changed and we start to think about new, whether it's a threat or basically just new mechanisms in space do we really have the strategies in place in order to deal with it? Can we look ahead to the implications of what that might mean, and ensure that we're not, years down the road in a position where we haven't really thought through what that could actually mean for us? Is really, when we see whatever the tests or demonstrations are, we've just got to go back and kind of reassess and make sure that we're really in the best position. And it really is a strategic discussion on that. It's about the strategy. What are you going to do? We can work a lot of technologies to support this, and but from a technology perspective, we can be all over the place in solution space if we don't really get back to kind of like, what is the core? What does it really mean to us? And should we or shouldn't we not do something about it?
Brigadier, maybe I'll start you with this one. We'll switch topics slightly. In an interview with Reuters this week, Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall expressly used the term arms race when talking about hypersonics. I believe he was the first Pentagon official, I believe U.S. official, to actually say arms race when talking about this technology. We sometimes will ask people that question, and they're always very careful to not say exactly that phrasing. So that struck me a little bit. His full quote was, quote, "There is an arms race, not necessarily for increased numbers, but for increased quality. It's an arms race that has been going on for quite some time, and the Chinese have been very aggressive." The first question, I guess, is, do you agree with Secretary Kendall's assessment? And then maybe the second question is, are we too far along to slow this down? Or is there still an opportunity to try and avoid an arms race in this technology going further?
Sure. So I'm not sure if we can use the term arms race when China and also Russia have already deployed different kinds of hypersonic weapons, and the U.S. has only conducted a handful of tests. I guess if we do say it's an arms race, then the U.S. is losing for sure. And I think, so I'm not sure if I would necessarily say this is an arms race where the United States must catch up to achieve, parity or superiority in hypersonic weapons the way we might need to do for strategic nuclear forces. But I do think what we're seeing here is that China's intent is to continue building its military capabilities, and that we're behind in our military capacity and capability. So I think the United States does need to continue pushing ahead on our own hypersonic development first and foremost. And that's not necessarily because we need to catch up and have the same amount or have more, but because hypersonics do provide a really good military advantage that the United States should take advantage of. Laura mentioned before that we might have a different strategy than China in our hypersonic weapons, and I think that's true. For example, hypersonic weapons would be really useful for avoiding China's and Russia's air and missile defense, A2D2 systems that we've been so concerned about for so long. They also make perfect candidates for time-sensitive targets like transporter erector launchers, or critical command and control nodes. So I think the United States, it's important that we continue moving ahead with this technology. But then the other side of it is, if we do let China and Russia, win any supposed arms race, then we are ceding that advantage to them. We don't want them to have these useful capabilities for their own strategies, whereas we don't, and we're left without this new, more useful technology. So that answers your first question, and your second question was, how do we slow it down?
I guess, or should there be a slowdown, or is it a situation where it's just, the chances of getting Russia and China to the table and negotiating about these things are just slim, and so the U.S. needs to, again, not to necessarily equate parity, but to be able to have its own counter to the situation.
Right. So like I said, we need hypersonics. We should pursue them for our own military strategy. I think, obviously, I would want to get Russia and China to stop and to limit what they're doing, but I don't really see a space right now for where we say, okay, well, we'll stop developing if you guys put a cap on them, because our military leaders, I think, have made it clear that these would be useful for U.S. military strategy.
Laura, I guess I'd ask you the same question, and particularly, again, the question I'm interested in, I guess, from you is the question of, is there an opportunity space here to negotiate? Should there be negotiations? Is it a situation where, again, these are comparable to nuclear weapons, where there needs to be some sort of coming together to try to cap them for the good of humanity, or is this a situation where, as we've talked about a little bit here, these are items that are going to be conventionally used in a lot of ways, and in some ways they're just another munition, and you don't necessarily see negotiations over how many missiles the U.S. and Russia each have that are conventional missiles launched off airplanes or whatnot.
Right. So that's good. Thanks for just focusing on the second question, because I actually agreed with a lot of what Patty Jane said. I don't think there's a ton of value in just pursuing the technologies to make sure that we have exactly what Russia and China have. I think the U.S. really, there's many programs right now being funded, and they're not all with a super clear strategic purpose, and it is more sort of, and it's important to understand the technology, not to see that, knowledge about the technology, but I think we'd want to be really careful about what exactly is it for, what role is it, what roles are they pursuing, and I think for that same reason, my guess is that the ability to just limit this type of technology is probably not the right approach anyway, because they play such different strategic roles. My guess is if there's going to be a cap on them or a moderation of the dangers they pose, which might be their short time of flight and difficulty of attribution, any of the technical things that we're worried about speeding up conflicts or creating conflicts, any of those types of dangers that they might especially pose are likely to be resolved within a more comprehensive discussion around strategy. If it's a reaction to missile defenses, it's likely to need to be in a conversation which is all about strategic stability and nuclear weapons and missile defenses and conventional things. And of course, that's super complicated, but my guess is that's going to be where those conversations end up, rather than a sort of a stovepiped technology discussion, because they're just used for such different things. That's where I think that's most likely.
Greg, I see you're nodding your head.
Oh, he's nodding.
I do agree with a lot of what everybody's saying here. It's, there's an evolution of technology that's occurring. The U.S. has obviously been tied up, busy doing other things. And I think both Russia and China, obviously time has gone by. They've had a chance to make investments that are suitable. We really need to take a look at where our investments are. We can look historically, obviously, where they have been, and just really take a look at the threats that are being discussed, and just make sure we do a careful consideration as to how far along we need to move in order to be competitive in this environment. And competitive means it isn't that we want to go, obviously, have a conflict, but you do not want to leave yourself at such a disadvantage that it becomes a problem for everybody, not just the U.S., but everybody involved in that. So I think it's time to really take a close look at the capabilities, how effective they would be, where they play into basically our strategy, whether it's on a theater level in a conflict or elsewhere, and make sure that we're basically well equipped, because it becomes part of our instrument of actually keeping the peace and not necessarily leaving yourself at a huge disadvantage.
I mean, it sounds like there's consensus here then. This cat is out of the proverbial bag at a hypersonic speed, and it's more about dealing with it at this point than trying to get that back under control. Which is interesting timing to have this discussion, because recently, I believe it was last week, the Biden administration officially said it wanted to start discussions with China about nuclear and strategic stability. In the previous administration, this was a big push to get China to sign on to the New START renewal that was being debated. Obviously, when the new administration came in, they disagreed, restarted New START, extended it, and said we'll have discussions with China later. And now it appears those discussions are, at least in Washington's side, hoping to start soon. I guess I'm wondering, and maybe Laura, will start with you, what are realistic goals here for what a strategic stability discussion with China might actually involve?
Oh, so these are really hard questions, and I think we should have our expectations set appropriately, like not have too lofty goals. But I'm glad to see that this might happen. I know this has happened in fits and starts, and the United States has sought this type of dialogue for a long time, and it's gone on in different tracks 1.5, and there's occasionally high-level talks. But I think it is increasingly important because things are changing pretty rapidly, and I think that talking about strategic stability, I'm not even sure both sides will agree what strategic stability
That's a great point.
means of what we're talking about. I think China may have like a much more sort of holistic, comprehensive view of strategic stability and not want to just talk about nuclear weapons. So I think even getting on the same page is a good idea. I think I've been trying to listen to my U.S. and outside U.S. and Chinese colleagues about this. So some of the things I thought sounded kind of interesting. Of course, there is this effort to get the P5 countries and the nuclear weapons countries to agree that that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And maybe you think, of course that's true, and saying something like that is not so important. But I actually think it's a really useful place for the U.S. and China to start, especially when we see there are indications that China is not confident that a conflict between the U.S. and China would remain conventional. You see indications, at least in the Defense Department recent report, and other analysts are indicating that China is looking at, lower yield nuclear weapons, more usable nuclear weapons, and perhaps responding to the U.S. development of such weapons in U.S. Policy, NPR statements that it might consider using nuclear weapons first in the case where, there's an existential risk. Indications that both that deterrence and no first use might be under pressure. So having these conversations about let's just agree that we should never fight a nuclear war. We should not organize our nuclear structure in order to do so. That's maybe low-hanging fruit, maybe harder than you think. Discussions about no first use. Of course, China has always had this no first use policy. There's lots of skepticism in the U.S. government about it, but it does seem to be a very sincerely held belief in China. The United States may also adopt a no first use policy. I could only hope. I would love to see that. But so then a discussion about how those two countries see that and what appropriate force structures would convince the other that was a true strategy. Those would be interesting places to start talking about, even exchange of information about missile defense. What are U.S. plans for missile defense? And I think one of the challenges I think China sees, I'm only on the outside, is not the existence of these systems, but sort of the open-ended nature of the pursuit of missile defenses. So what's the shape? What's the endpoint? What can we expect? And of course, the U.S. current policy is not to try to defend against China or Russia's using missile defenses, but to have some sort of information exchanges and to understand better what China's conventional aggressions in the Indo-Pacific region. What are the limits? Where are red lines? I think any kinds of those discussions would be helpful. And I'm one of those people who believe also that having discussions in and of themselves, even if you don't land on an agreement, that the development of those relationships are really important, because we haven't had the same history as we had with the Soviet Union and then Russia, where we developed some understanding with which we can judge others' behavior, because you have relationships, you understand who the other person you have on the other side is. Oh, and speaking, I guess the last thing I would love to see is perhaps a more formalization and more extensive emergency communications between the countries, crisis management. So I think most likely it would be wonderful to see really focused on crisis management and transparency and better understanding.
I mean, just listening to what you just listed there, which is, I think, a lot of detail, I think maybe the average person, the average American would look at this and say, that's pretty basic stuff.
Yeah.
We have that with Russia, and you see in the movies, right? You know, the president picks up the line and tells, "Yeah, we didn't do this." You know, it was the aliens. So I guess it seems like what you're saying is a lot of kind of, for lack of a better term, low-hanging fruit. That's basic communications and trying to get everyone on the same page to understand, as you said at the beginning, when we say we're going to have strategic talks, what does that even mean for the Chinese? Kai-Jane, I'd love you to respond to what Laura said, and maybe the place to start is that point of, is what we need out of these talks the just basic understanding of what the other side is thinking about?
Yeah, honestly, I agree with a lot of what Laura said. I was going to talk myself about just the importance of talking and trying to understand China's intentions and what they're planning on doing, and the importance of communication that we have had with the Soviet Union and Russia for a number of years. And it kind of goes towards the other point that I wanted to make, is that I worry that the administration, or that there might be just such a focus on getting a deal, an arms control deal with China, and I don't think that should be the push, because arms control is it's not valuable in and of itself. Arms control is only useful when it helps limit threats to the United States and its allies, and that's why I think talking is a great place to start, and where we should go with arms control for now. Obviously, I would love if we can come to a trilateral arms control agreement with Russia and China in the future. I think that will be very difficult to do for now, especially when the United States is just beginning its nuclear modernization programs, whereas China and Russia are cranking out new capabilities. So I think the focus now should be on talking with China the best we can as the United States continues to bolster its deterrence, and then hopefully discuss future limitations.
I'm going to throw a softball to you. No first use policy. Is this something that you do think there could be common ground with the U.S. and China? Do you think it's something that, as a way to build relationships between them and to have kind of a better understanding of this baseline that we're talking about?
Well, I think a no first use policy would be dangerous for the United States to adopt, and I don't think we should adopt a policy that would be dangerous for the sake of a nice communication with China. And I won't drown on along the reasons why I think it's dangerous. But I think just the two quick reasons are that first, it would kind of enable China and Russia to be able to come up to the below the nuclear threshold line and embolden them to use their chemical, biological weapons, or just non-strategic attacks below the nuclear threshold. I think that's dangerous. And two, our allies are very opposed to the U.S. adoption of a no first use policy, and that's for good reason. They're the ones who are on the front lines of a potential conflict with Russia and China, and that's why they're so unnerved about it. And I think it's important we listen and work with our allies who are worried about U.S. extended deterrence commitments.
Craig, Laura brought up an interesting point about missile defenses, which is China's understanding of what U.S. missile defenses are for and what they're capable of. This is an argument we've seen from Russia for years, is, all right, well, the U.S. is putting missile defenses in Europe. That's actually an offensive capability. Mass is a defensive capability. How can we trust it? I'm wondering, in your mind, how much of that argument you think deserves credence. And when I say that argument, I guess I'm talking about whether China, believes that these U.S. systems, as Russia seems to at least publicly say, are really just secretly offensive systems and are threats to them. Do you think there is a real basis for that, or do you think these are just public-facing statements?
Yeah, it's certainly not something I've heard much of, or really can speak much about. It does seem odd to look at our U.S. missile defenses and say that's the reason for building such capabilities out there. I think if they're building capabilities, then they're building it to be a threat of some sort for us, whether that's a theater or strategic threat. So I would probably turn that back into a conversation about what could be accomplished with said capabilities, as opposed to kind of the intent that they're reading out of the U.S. as to why they may or may not be building them. They're making advances. They are changing things. And it is concerning, definitely, to think about speed and agility and making a mistake or miscalculation in that. Laura also brought up, I think, a really great point about limited nuclear is also certainly a concern. And we can't afford limited nuclear to become an existential threat to the U.S. Also. So we also need to take a look to make sure that if that is or does become part of their plans, that we have the force structure and we can basically de-escalate and not have limited choices should something like that manifest.
So the nuclear issue, I think, is something that we should just hit on here because we are, I believe, in the next month or two, we're hoping to start seeing some stuff about the Missile Defense Review, Nuclear Posture Review, and National Defense Strategy, which are for the first time all being done together in a cohesive fashion. Technically, that may have happened in the past, but I think anybody who followed the rollout of those things would say that maybe there was some siloing going on. So I guess one of the things that I'm interested in, and Patty Jane, maybe we'll start with you on this, is the nuclear modernization plan the U.S. has right now was essentially started under the Obama administration. I believe 2012 was when it was agreed to, at least the basis of it. The nuclear posture review in the Trump administration didn't really change much. It called for the creation of some new systems, but nothing, I think, dramatic aside from those. And already there's some questions about whether those will continue going forward or not. I guess I'm wondering, in your mind, does a plan that was largely formed in 2012, slightly altered, but it kept on place so far, is this a plan that lines up with what's required to deal with China, given China and Russia didn't accept the investments they've made since then?
Yeah, so good question. I think the short answer is no. Our current nuclear modernization plan was formulated 2010, 2012 for a completely different threat environment. Russia, the 2010 NPR actually considered Russia to no longer be an adversary. China only had a very minimal nuclear deterrent at that time, and we didn't expect them to go through this strategic breakout. And the other thing is that our nuclear modernization plans, they were meant to deter one peer nuclear threat, that being Russia, and then China and other threats like North Korea have been considered lesser included cases this whole time. But now we see China on its way to become a peer competitor with the United States. So I think that's kind of logically, when you look at that, a nuclear force, a nuclear capability meant to deter only one nuclear peer won't suffice to deter double that, two nuclear peers, Russia and China. And so I do think the two additional capabilities in President Trump's NPR will help, especially the addition of the nuclear sea-launched cruise missile. That is supposed to respond to the rise in regional nuclear threats, both in the European and in the Pacific theaters. But ultimately, I think we're going to need to take a close look at our targeting requirements, our deterrence requirements, because now, as Admiral Richard, the STRATCOM commander, has said, China can no longer be considered a lesser case when it comes to nuclear deterrence requirements. So what changing our nuclear posture will look like, I don't know. That's hopefully going to be a project for next year, and I would kind of expect that to come into the public debate for the next couple of years of what we're going to do. But I do think that the dramatic change in threat from 2010, when we figured out our force posture, will need to be relooked at.
Craig, thoughts on this?
On the nuclear discussion?
On the nuclear discussion, I guess the technical, so the aspect of it, is the U.S. modernization postured, capability standpoint, postured in a way that is still relevant, given what we've seen out of China over the last decade?
Very difficult for me to comment on. I don't actually work a lot of the nuclear areas, and obviously I wouldn't be able to jump into a lot of detail on that. From a missile warning, missile tracking perspective, or how can space contribute, it's really going back to the same thing as, are we able to monitor and understand the situation of what's going on, try to get information to a decision maker in a timely fashion so they make the right calculation for the situation and don't make a mistake. So I see the value of space here in trying to help in the nuclear discussion on that, but not necessarily, obviously, not contributing really to that.
So the same core concepts as when we're talking about hypersonics.
it's the same core content. When you get to the, obviously to the hypersonics, it's a different discussion, obviously, and I'm not, jumping into whether they're nuclear or non-nuclear. But I would actually, basically just point out that the natures of these, threat and the delivery mechanisms, everything's changing, and we need to make sure that we're providing, the right kind of capabilities to monitor what's happening and obviously, as I mentioned, make the right decision.
Lori, thoughts on the nuclear modernization?
Well, I certainly think there are a lot of places where we can reduce the role of nuclear weapons, that they're not useful in lots of ways. And I think this conversation about no first use and allies is an interesting one, because it's hard for me to see situations in which an ally would like a conventional conflict to go nuclear. In fact, I think extended deterrence might be best served by stronger investments in conventional capabilities rather than sort of sub-strategic nuclear weapons. So I certainly think the modernization is enormously costly, I think, and a lot of it could be scaled back in sort of service of a deterrent-only structure. I think, who you invited here. I think it is overkill to be right on the nose for it. So I don't think that it's materially changed. I think that China's. I guess I would appeal to Rose Gottemeller's quote in the New York Times earlier this week, where she cautions against sort of the automaticity of responding to an evolved threat with just more missiles, more missile defense, thinking that solves your strategic problem, that we really need to interrupt that dynamic in a smart way before we find ourselves in another arms race, which didn't serve us well the first time, and will be, my guess is, even more extraordinarily dangerous in a multipolar world. So you have to be, I think, really thoughtful, not just thinking hardware, of course, but thinking it across. I know the last panel didn't love the whole of government approach, but the idea that you really have to use all the tools in your toolbox to address these strategic problems. So I would love to see a nuclear posture which really took advantage of all those tools.
We have just a couple of minutes here, so I'm going to ask maybe kind of a closing quick question, since we brought up the nuclear posture review and the missile defense review, and by we, I mean I brought it up. What's one thing that you're looking for out of these documents that are coming up? Again, the National Defense Strategy, Missile Defense Review, the Nuclear Posture Review. And maybe we'll go Craig, Laura, Patty, Jane down this way, and forget Craig, maybe from a technical standpoint, what capability are you looking to see? If there's investments or downgrades, what's the thing that you think is something to keep an eye on as these documents roll out? Right.
Obviously, space, you're seeing a lot of emphasis on resilience in space. We're expecting to see more and more of that. That's very helpful. And basically, it doesn't cause us to have to do other things, obviously, to make things resilient. So trying to build into your architecture so you've got less, you want to have less vulnerability, you don't want to be exposed, and that's been a strategy. But you're seeing a lot more emphasis on basically just inherent resilience and not necessarily having to do more. When it comes to the hypersonic discussion, certainly more clarity as it starts to roll down as to what the U.S.'s posture plans to be. Is it going to be defense, no defense? Obviously, theater is a different situation. That all helps us at least on the technology side, make sure that we're putting investments in the right place and fielding the right force structure. This doesn't come cheap, so we want to make sure that we're investing in the right areas and just trying to make sure that we're lined up with, kind of back to the core point of this panel, which I believe is to a large degree, what's the strategy? Well, let's just make sure that we're aligned up with that strategy.
Okay. Laura?
Thanks, Craig. I agree with Craig's first point, to look for a really a smart, resilient strategy in space. I think we haven't been strategic in that way, and I think that helps assuage some of the concerns and anxiety about things like the anti-satellite tests that we saw that Russia conducted. It's very difficult to defend satellites, but you can certainly defend capabilities that satellite systems bring to you, and by investing in a smart way and, being able to replenish satellite capabilities, distribute their capabilities. So I think there's a long way to go there, and I would be glad to see that if those strategies are part of a review like this. And of course, President Biden has long been a champion of reducing the role of nuclear weapons in national security. So I'd love to see some alignment along that direction. I'm very interested to see how that plays out.
Beijing.
I would like to see continuity, at least in the nuclear posture review. I think that the current nuclear modernization program we have is the right way to continue on right for now. I obviously don't expect the Biden administration to have figured out what to do about China's strategic breakout in the last couple of months, but we see bipartisan support for the current nuclear modernization program, and that's for good reason, especially given the new China threat. I don't think now is the time to reduce the role of nuclear weapons. Maybe it would have been a couple of years ago, but now that the threat is increasing, and I think deterrence matters more than ever. We also see overwhelming bipartisan support for things like the land leg of the triad. Democratic-led House and Senate both expressed that they would like to see that modernized as we move forward. So that's what I'm hoping for in the nuclear posture review, and I do think that's what we will get to, because I think that, I know the nuclear posture review is being conducted by looking at the threat, and when we look at what China's doing, I think it's hard to deny that we need to ensure we have a strong nuclear deterrence posture moving forward.
All right. Well, with that, thanks to my panelists for taking the time to chat with us and for this great event. For the closing remarks, we have Dr. Kori Buckley, the Vice President of Air and Space Forces at MITRE.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks to our panel. Again, I'm Kori Buckley, Vice President of the Air and Space Forces Center at the MITRE Corporation. I have the honor of closing out today's event. I want to first thank our moderators, our excellent moderators, our panelists, certainly Vice Admiral Hill, who joined us today, for their contributions. I also want to thank our generous host, Aerospace, certainly Steve Zakowicz, our CEO, and Jamie Morin, who did a lot of work behind the scenes to make this happen. And I want to make sure that I thank our events and communications teams. I think we all know how some of these hybrid events, the challenges that these present. So certainly, thank you for your seamless contributions and both hosting us in person and online. I think it was a great job and a great success by all. We did hear from our speakers today about the challenges and ideas around what the U.S. needs to do to respond to the PRC's threat. We talked about things around the capabilities, the ways that we can respond to long-range precision strikes. We just heard a lot about hypersonics. Our first panel, we talked about things around countering space, cyber, a lot of the nuclear deterrence and some of those long-range challenges that we have. We heard a lot about C2, information advantage. From our first panel, we heard some of the challenges, especially around talking about what the U.S. industrial base and from a talent perspective, some of the challenges and the responses that we need. We heard things like disruptive innovation, making sure that we're partnering with our allies, maybe even voluntary civil participation that we heard. I think, certainly things that we should all be thinking about going forward. From Vice Admiral Hill, he gave a great talk on the evolving threat environment for the missile defense, as well as our need to respond with advances to their challenges around range, speed, precision, and maneuver. He talked about how we are working to improve our layered defense system around sensors, C2, warfighting assets, and weapons. And then with our last panel on the evolving missile environment, we heard about a debate. I liked the hyper-hype debate on how do we even characterize the hypersonic technology threats that are out there? What are the challenges to sensing, tracking, and countering those threats, both on the theater and the strategic aspects? And when we talked about, we heard a little bit about the importance of communications and understanding intent and red lines. And I thought it was a great discussion finishing up on whether or not our current nuclear modernization plans really are sufficient for meeting today's threat. So in closing, I certainly echo many of those comments. I challenge all of us to be mission partners in helping our Indo-PACOM warfighting community really rapidly advance those operational technologies that we heard about, some of the thinking that we need and those capabilities to meet those urgent warfighter needs. And we have to do this at speed. I think that was really the theme for today. So with that, and for all of those here and those online, thank you very much for joining us today. I think it was a wonderful discussion, and we certainly look forward to hosting similar events in the future. Thank you.